Sir, why are you reaching toward your jacket?
I'm not my ID is in my pocket. How would you like me to proceed?
Do you have any weapons on you?
Yes, legally carried. My hands are visible and I'm complying.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where doing exactly what you were told was the most dangerous choice you could make? We are often taught from a very young age that compliance guarantees safety. We like to believe that if we follow the instructions, keep our hands visible, and speak respectfully, the system will naturally protect us. But what happens when the person holding the badge and the gun brings their own deep-seated assumptions into the quiet isolation of a late-night parking lot? What happens when the gap between the orders you are given and the actions you are allowed to take becomes a trap? Before we dive into tonight's story, take a quick second to drop a comment below and let me know. Do you think carrying a personal dash cam or audio recorder is a basic necessity in today's world? Share your thoughts, because the events we are about to unpack prove that sometimes the only thing standing between the absolute truth and a fabricated official report is a tiny piece of plastic clipped to a shoulder strap. The night air was heavy and thick when Marcus pulled his sedan off the main highway, the tires crunching against the worn asphalt of an empty roadside fueling station. It was pushing closer to midnight on a Thursday. He had been behind the wheel for the better part of 3 hours, navigating the long, dark stretches of interstate, fueled only by the thought of his wife, Dana, and their twin boys waiting for him at home. The fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for miles, and his cell phone battery was clinging to its final sliver of life. The brightly lit canopy of the station offered a temporary oasis in an otherwise pitch-black county. Marcus was 38 years old, a man whose entire adult life had been defined by structure, discipline, and careful calculation. As an active-duty logistics officer in the United States military, he had survived multiple overseas deployments. His daily professional life revolved around coordinating complex movements where a single misjudgment could lead to catastrophic, irreversible outcomes. His superiors frequently noted that his greatest asset was his unwavering precision. He was not a man prone to sudden, jerky movements, nor was he someone who left room for ambiguity. He was methodical. Every action had a purpose. As he stepped out of his vehicle to swipe his payment card, he instinctively brushed his right arm against his hip to confirm the placement of his sidearm. It was a standard-issue weapon secured in a regulation holster. He was carrying it openly and entirely legally, in full compliance with state law and his active-duty transit requirements. To Marcus, the firearm was just another piece of equipment, checked with the same absent-minded routine as adjusting a rearview mirror. He stood beneath the buzzing fluorescent lights, waiting for the fuel pump to engage, completely unaware that his life was about to be irreversibly shattered. Inside the station's glass storefront, a weary cashier was quietly reviewing inventory sheets, occasionally taking sips from a lukewarm mug of coffee. He briefly glanced through the window, noting the solitary customer before returning to his paperwork. But there is a vital piece of information you need to know right now, something the cashier couldn't see, and more importantly, something the approaching patrol car didn't know either. Marcus was wearing a recording device. It wasn't issued by a police department. It was a small, commercially available, clip-on body camera fastened securely to the strap of his shoulder bag. He had purchased it a few months prior after listening to a fellow officer recount a horrific traffic stop. That colleague had been thrown to the pavement, only to later read an official police summary that completely fabricated the events. Without video evidence, the official narrative became the unquestioned truth. Marcus had sworn he would never allow himself to be erased by somebody else's paperwork. As a pair of blinding headlights suddenly swerved violently into the station's lot, Marcus reached up and double-tapped the device. The tiny lens began capturing everything. The cruiser did not approach with the measured caution of a routine community check. It aggressively angled its chassis, trapping Marcus's vehicle against the concrete island. Red and blue strobes violently fractured the darkness. The local county sheriff stepped out of the driver's side. He was a veteran of the department, a man who had worn the local star for over a decade. He carried himself with the heavy, unyielding posture of someone who expected the world to immediately submit to his presence. His eyes instantly locked onto the holstered weapon resting on Marcus's hip. Recognizing the sudden escalation, Marcus immediately raised his hands. He pushed his palms forward, spreading his fingers wide at his shoulder height, offering zero threat. He calmly and clearly announced his military rank, stated that he was an active-duty serviceman, and explicitly noted that his sidearm was legally permitted. He politely asked the law enforcement officer to explain the legal basis for the detainment. The sheriff's posture grew rigid. The request for a legal justification, the simple invocation of constitutional rights, seemed to offend him deeply. Resting his hand heavily on the grip of his own service weapon, the sheriff ordered the military officer to step away from the car. Marcus complied perfectly, his hands never wavering from the air. He asked once more in a completely level tone if he was under arrest and what the reasonable suspicion was for the stop. The sheriff barked that he did not owe anyone an explanation. Then came the impossible trap. Marcus calmly stated that his military identification was located inside the right breast pocket of his jacket. He asked the sheriff for specific permission and instructions on how to retrieve it safely. The sheriff loudly commanded him not to reach for anything. Marcus stood frozen, acknowledging the paradox. He explained, his voice steady despite the rising adrenaline, that he could not produce the requested identification without lowering his hand to reach his pocket. The sheriff simply shouted the conflicting order again, "Show the ID, but do not move your hands." It was in this agonizing space between commands that the sheriff's underlying bias bled into the open. In a low, seething voice, he muttered that individuals like Marcus always had a convenient excuse, always tried to talk their way out of things, and always assumed the law didn't apply to them. It was a staggering misjudgment, a projection of personal prejudice onto a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Marcus politely asked the man to repeat what he had just said. A flicker of something dark crossed the sheriff's face, a realization that he had exposed his own unjustified animosity. He quickly masked it with pure aggression, threatening that if Marcus moved toward the holster, it would be the last mistake he ever made. Marcus spoke slowly, articulating every syllable to ensure there could be no misunderstanding. He stated that he was slowly reaching for his wallet to prove his identity. The silence of the night was shattered by the deafening crack of a gunshot. Marcus collapsed onto the cold concrete, clutching his lower abdomen. His wallet remained tucked safely inside his pocket. His hands had been entirely empty. Inside the convenience store, the cashier had ducked behind the counter, but his smartphone was already pressed against the glass. He had recognized the hostility of the officer's approach immediately and had been filming for nearly a minute. But the most crucial witness was the small black lens still clipped to Marcus's shoulder strap. As the wounded soldier lay bleeding on the ground, his personal camera continued to roll. It captured the horrifying sequence of events, and then it captured something even more chilling. It captured the sheriff keying his radio microphone and pausing. For 4 excruciating seconds, the only sound was the heavy breathing of a man trying to construct a lie. After those 4 seconds of profound silence, the sheriff finally spoke into his radio. He reported that a suspect was down. He claimed the suspect had aggressively reached for a concealed weapon and refused lawful orders. He began building the protective wall of his official narrative, entirely unaware that the truth was already safely stored on a digital memory card. By the time the clock struck midnight, a team of surgeons was frantically working to save Marcus's life. The projectile had shattered bone and caused massive internal trauma, missing his vital organs by mere millimeters. Down the sterile, brightly lit hospital corridor, Dana sat shivering in a plastic chair. Her 2 young boys were huddled against her sides, fast asleep, completely oblivious to the nightmare their family had just been plunged into. While the medical staff fought to stabilize Marcus, The sheriff was sitting in a quiet office, typing up his incident report. He used the polished, sterilized vocabulary of institutional defense. He typed phrases like refusal to comply, perceived immediate threat, and furtive movements. He knew exactly how the system functioned. He understood that if you submit the paperwork first, using the right legally protective buzzwords, you create a foundational truth that is incredibly difficult for a victim to dismantle, especially a victim who might not survive the night. He submitted the document, clocked out, and drove home to sleep. But by the time the sun rose, the local district attorney had already received 3 separate pieces of undeniable evidence. First, the gas station's overhead security footage, which clearly showed Marcus's hands raised and motionless. Second, the cashier's cell phone video, which captured the sheriff's deeply prejudiced remarks. And finally, the undeniable high-definition audio and video from Marcus's personal device. It captured the impossible conflicting commands. It captured the total lack of aggression from the military officer, and it captured those damning 4 seconds of silence where the sheriff calculated his fabricated defense. The district attorney was a woman who did not tolerate corruption. She watched the footage in absolute silence, picked up her office phone, and ordered her lead investigator to pull every single field report the sheriff had filed over his entire career. When you start digging into records that no one has bothered to scrutinize, patterns emerge. Over the previous 2 years, this specific sheriff had conducted 3 similar late-night stops involving legally armed citizens. In all 3 of those previous incidents, the encounters ended peacefully. Hands were kept visible, permits were checked, and everyone went home safely. There was only one glaring difference between those 3 peaceful stops and the near-fatal encounter at the gas station: the demographic background of the citizens. The first 3 men were from a different background than Marcus. The evidence was irrefutable. The sheriff had not reacted to the presence of a weapon. He had reacted to his own biased assumptions about the man carrying it. He had manufactured a threat where absolutely none existed, driven by a profound and dangerous misjudgment. Let me pause here and ask you something. If Marcus hadn't spent a few extra dollars to clip that camera to his bag, his voice would have been silenced. The official police report would have been filed, stamped, and accepted as reality. Do you believe justice would have been served based solely on the word of an injured man against a veteran officer? Drop a yes or no in the comments. It is a terrifying reality to consider, and it highlights exactly why protecting yourself with your own documentation is so incredibly vital. The investigation tore the lid off a toxic history. The county archives revealed years of buried complaints, allegations of excessive force, reports from fellow officers detailing instances of severe bias, and a massive civil settlement that had been quietly paid out by the county using taxpayer dollars to make a previous lawsuit disappear. The county leadership hadn't just failed to supervise this man, they had actively enabled him, renewing his contract and ignoring the glaring warning signs because it was politically convenient. Months later, the tension inside the courthouse was suffocating. The room was packed to absolute capacity, with an overflow crowd watching on monitors down the hall. The sheriff, stripped of his badge, his uniform, and the immense institutional power he had wielded for a decade, sat at the defense table looking remarkably small in a plain suit. He was no longer the undisputed authority of the county. He was simply a defendant waiting for a jury of his peers to hold him accountable. Marcus walked into the courtroom with a noticeable limp. The surgeries had saved his life, but the massive accumulation of scar tissue had permanently altered his mobility. His physical therapists had warned him that the pain would likely be a lifelong companion. Yet, as he took the witness stand, his posture was rigidly straight. Dana sat a few rows back, her eyes fiercely locked onto her husband. When the prosecuting attorney asked Marcus to identify the individual who had nearly ended his life, the room held its collective breath. Marcus slowly turned his head. He looked directly into the eyes of the man who had shot him and calmly confirmed his identity. There was no theatrical rage, no dramatic shouting. His quiet, unshakable dignity filled the massive room. The defense attorney attempted the standard maneuvers. He argued the immense pressure of the job, the split-second decisions required in law enforcement, and the inherent danger of approaching an armed individual. He tried to claim that Marcus's perfectly legal questions about his rights constituted a form of verbal resistance that justified a lethal response. But the prosecution didn't need to argue. They simply turned off the lights and played the tapes. They played the wide angle showing the surrender. They played the cashier's footage capturing the prejudice. And then they played the personal audio. The impossible commands echoed through the silent courtroom. "Don't reach," followed immediately by "Show me your ID," the gunshot. And finally, the agonizing, calculated 4 seconds of silence before the lie was broadcast over the radio. In their closing arguments, the prosecution didn't scream about corruption. They simply pointed to the pattern. They displayed the files of the other armed citizens who had been treated with respect and contrasted them with the terrifying prejudice directed at Marcus. They asked the jury to deeply consider what a man is thinking about during 4 seconds of dead air right after pulling a trigger. The jury did not take long. The verdict was delivered with a heavy, solemn finality. Guilty on all major charges, including the severe deprivation of civil rights under the color of law and aggravated assault. There was no cheering in the courtroom, only the heavy exhale of a community that realized a massive wound was finally being acknowledged. During the sentencing hearing weeks later, Marcus stood to deliver his statement. He didn't speak about the agonizing physical therapy, the sleepless nights, or the financial strain, though all of that was true. Instead, he spoke about his children. He described the heartbreaking morning he finally returned home from the hospital. He explained how his young sons had climbed into his bed, terrified of hurting him, staring at the massive bandages wrapped around his torso. He told the judge how his youngest boy had looked up at him with the innocent, devastating logic of a child and asked, "Dad, did you do something wrong to make the police officer mad at you?" The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Marcus explained to the judge that he had to look his beautiful child in the eyes and explain that sometimes people who are given immense power make terrible, dangerous assumptions about you before you ever even open your mouth. He explained that the burden of having that conversation with a child is a trauma that no hospital chart can ever fully document. He ended his statement by looking directly at the judge and asking one simple, profound question. How is it possible that a local law enforcement officer is allowed to have less discipline in a quiet parking lot than a military soldier is required to have in an active combat zone? The judge handed down a sentence of 30 years in the state penitentiary. She stared down at the disgraced officer and noted that he had weaponized his authority against the very citizens he was sworn to protect. The gavel slammed down, echoing like a final gunshot, and the man was led out through a side door, stripped of everything. The ripple effects of that sentence tore through the local government. Previous convictions tied to the disgraced officer were aggressively reopened and reviewed. Innocent people who had been unfairly targeted were exonerated. The county was forced to implement massive, sweeping reforms. Mandatory camera activations, transparent civilian oversight boards, and strict demographic reporting for every single traffic stop were immediately enacted. The gas station cashier, the man who had crouched behind the counter and kept his camera steady, quietly returned to his normal life. When a local news reporter tracked him down, he humbly declined a massive interview, simply stating that he couldn't live with himself if he had just stood by and watched a good man get erased. Marcus eventually returned to his military duties, though heavily modified to accommodate his permanent injuries. He didn't seek out fame or endless media tours, but he did refuse to stay entirely silent. He began speaking to young recruits, community organizers, and civil rights groups. His message was incredibly clear: Expecting the system to automatically work in your favor is a dangerous illusion. We live in a world where the truth is incredibly fragile. The story of Marcus Reeves is a chilling reminder that your absolute best defense is your own irrefutable record. Not every terrible encounter is caught on a security camera. Not every victim survives to take the witness stand. But documentation is no longer a luxury for the paranoid. It is a fundamental necessity for survival. It is the solid wall that prevents an assumption from becoming an undisputed fact. Always know your legal rights. Always remain calm and respectful, but never be afraid to politely request the legal justification for your detainment. And above all else, record the interaction, because the only narrative that becomes history is the one that nobody is prepared to contradict. If this story resonated with you, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the cases that matter. Share this video with your family and friends. Everyone needs to understand how quickly a routine night can turn into a fight for the truth. And before you head out, drop into the comments and let me know what moment in this story shocked you the most. Until next time, watch out for each other, stay incredibly curious, and I will see you in the next one. Would you like me to find more stories about landmark legal cases that changed local laws?